It's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dick Onit. Dick used to be at ARPA-E. Do you know what ARPA-E is? Advanced Research Project Agency for Energy. In the time period from 2019 to 2024, end of 2024. And before that, Dick was with FERC. Do you know what FERC is? Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in US for 40 years. And Dick was telling me that during these 40 years, he worked with same team chairman, mostly Democrats. And also some Republicans. Well, I can tell from myself that Dick had a great contributions in the way US markets, ISO markets are working today. In terms of developing grid codes, operational requirements, and also policies and long-term plans. So he made a great contribution for the time he worked for FERC and also for ARPA. So Dick, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. So in the next 1 hour and a half, Dick will talk about next generation of ISO markets. Let's thank you for coming.
What I want to talk about today is that, first of all, the job of ISO market design is not over yet. My feeling is we're about halfway there. I have probably more slides than I'm going to be able to deal with, so let's get started. Just as a general outline, here's what I intend to talk about. First of all, I want to do a little bit of background and some context for U.S. regulation. Emphasize what is called beneficiary pay pricing that FERC has adopted in certain contexts, and then talk about energy markets, and also talk about investment markets, which are very different. And when we first got started, we thought that investment would be privatized and would take care of itself, and there would be lots of competition and everything else. Well, it didn't turn out to be that way. The new ideas in reliability, principally the fact that reliability has to include extreme weather, which we have experienced in the last 10 years. And that at the end, to talk about the advances in optimization that has taken place that allows a lot of this stuff to happen. Without the improvements in the software, that these would just be part of theoretical papers. Market design, when you look at across this market design across the world, you find out it's essentially path dependent. In most of the Europe, the power systems evolved from state-owned utilities or some entities that had very strong state involvement. And transmission essentially was to plan a power plant and then plan the transmission to get the power plant to the local utilities' customers. That's no longer the major role of transmission. As part of this, we developed a vocabulary just like everybody else does. And the vocabulary today is outdated and doesn't make a lot of sense in many cases, and I'll talk a little bit about that. My favorite quote in that regard is a quote from Max Planck, who says a new scientific proof does not triumph by convincing its opponents but to see the light, but because the opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up familiar with it. I think he was talking about quantum mechanics at the time, but I think in a certain sense it holds for electricity markets. Okay, beneficiaries pay. Should be very simple construct, but it's not a simple construct for the electric industry, especially given the fact that we've moved away from the vertically integrated utility market design. And it's very important. It's very important to regulatory economics and to market design. So we send the correct signals, both to the generation side of the market, the consumption side of the market, and the transportation or the transmission system. The tradition in the markets was, and you'll hear me use this term a lot, that rates were peanut buttered. Some people more technical sense say they were socialized, but what that means is they're spread over a broad section of the market and not necessarily in a way that would signal pricing to behave economically. And we need better pricing models, and I'll get to that. A little bit of background. 1935, the Federal Power Act was passed by Congress, and it's essentially stated that interstate wholesales and transmission would have to charge just and reasonable rates. Rates basically at the time meant prices. And also but do we know what just and reasonable is? Now, you people that are from Europe read the history and found out, there was a big debate in the Catholic Church in Europe about what is a just price, and the Romans had a just price, and most of the theory behind just prices came out of Europe. And that the rates not be unduly discriminatory, which is interesting because it uses a double negative. And what it does, whoops, did I turn this off? And what it does, did I? Oh, okay, sorry. Which implies that there are duly discriminatory rates. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. The interesting thing in the Power Act is that there were no certificates granted for transmission construction, and in the US, the certificates come with the right of eminent domain to take people's property at fair market value. From 1935 to approximately 97, the market was dominated by vertically integrated utilities, and the theory developed, and the lexicon and vocabulary developed around what the electric utilities did. And that vocabulary sort of implies certain things that don't make any sense anymore. I won't go through these in any great extent, but for example, the value of lost load. Does anybody know how they calculate the value of lost load in the United States, or at least they purport to calculate it? Oh, okay. So I'll teach you. It's the value of a combustion turbine run very few hours of the year. Now, what does that have to do with the value of load? Nothing. But that's called the value of lost load. It's essentially the marginal cost of serving the last customer whenever the last customer consumes. Another one is construction work in progress. Am I too far away? Well, okay. Construction work in progress means that the consumers take all the risk, and you pay for a facility as it is built and as the costs are incurred instead of afterwards when it actually becomes useful. The other thing, the last is peak load pricing. Peak load pricing is essentially a methodology for trying to discourage people from consuming on peak. And one of the favorite ways of doing that is with something called 4CP. We'll get to that later. And the correct concept is not peak load prices, but peak prices. Because today in a highly renewables world, you can have a whole bunch of generation, which is the way they measure peak, and the prices can be very low, and you want people to consume. You don't want to curtail the renewables. So raising the prices or giving incentives not to consume in those periods doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It made sense when you had an increasing marginal cost curve, and when the consumption went up, the price went up, but that's not going to be the case anymore. The case is going to be you want to have incentives to move off the peak when the peak is at high price. And you have to want to define the peak in terms of prices, not in terms of actual load. In 1997, FERC passed an order called Order 888. It's biblical and actually the street address of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We number our orders, I'll say we because I've spent 40 years at FERC, it's no longer we, but I can't get away from that habit. The numbering of orders at FERC is solely determined by the chairman, and he gets to name it any number he wants, as long as it's a number. And as a matter of fact, I'm not even sure he has to use a number. But that's the tradition. It ordered all utilities to open up their system, their transmission system, to access from others instead of just the vertically integrated utility. And to do that, we first of all proposed a natural gas model, which we had just got finished reforming. But it turns out, but it turns out that the natural gas model doesn't work for electricity because of Kirchhoff's laws. And valves in the natural gas system, the analogy is essentially a very expensive transmission gadget. And so we created an alternative. We said, all right, if you don't want to use the natural gas model, you don't have to. And in the alternative, you can essentially form an ISO and create a market. And the tight power pools in the Northeast essentially took that seriously and said, we're taking the other option. The current market design for ISOs and energy auction markets is now about 75% of the United States and growing. And the only area that isn't making what I would call progress is the southeast part of the United States, which is the old Confederacy that fought the Civil War and doesn't particularly like Washington, D.C. But the one thing that happened is that the average size of a vertically integrated utility was less than 5 gigawatts, and the average size of a ISO is greater than 50 gigawatts, and so they're 10 times larger. And the old criterion of N-1 reliability is no big deal. I was talking to the CEO of PJM several years ago, and he said, we're in N-16 all the time. So the idea of losing one generator is not a big deal when you have 50 or more gigawatts. But if you have a small system, let's say 5 gigawatts, and you have a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant, you got a problem if you lose it. So the N-1 stuff is not terribly important anymore. Okay, so efficient energy auctions. Back in 1877, Walras proposed a general equilibrium using a tentamol, which is to find the general equilibrium. And there's been at least a minor debate in the literature. some people have interpreted Tetramal to be a specific algorithm. If you translate that from French to English, what do you get? I gave it away. The translation is groping. Well, which is equivalent to an algorithm, but he doesn't specify what algorithm it is. And groping sort of covers a lot of different methodologies. In the 50s, we spent a lot of time, at least the theoretical economists, on general equilibrium models and proved a lot of theorems using fixed point theorems. And later, and this is my interpretation of the literature, at the time when most of this was happening, they didn't understand the relationship of convexity to general equilibrium models. And that's one of the problems I think that still exists today. And there are essentially two welfare theorems. One of them says, make sure the market is Pareto efficient. And the second one says, get good prices. And we have essentially done fairly well in the first one, but not terribly well in the second. Because convexity is the only guarantee that marginal costs create appropriate price signals in the markets. Later in '69, Starr, in trying to fit the non-convex markets into the general equilibrium theory, sort of said, well, if the market's really large, the prices clearing the convex hull of that market, close enough. Well, it turns out that large and close enough don't really work well. And so we have essentially what are called partial equilibrium models that generate prices, profits, and quantities that hopefully, today they probably don't, eventually satisfy the first and the second theorem. Again, the vocabulary has moved very quickly from regulation, cost of service regulation, to market regulation. And market regulation has developed a bunch of definitions that don't make a lot of sense. For example, you often hear the term market clearing price when it refers to the highest marginal cost in the system. That doesn't clear the market. And so what we have are uplift payments or make-whole payments, and they're, at least in the US, are not transparent. We don't know, the market does not know what those prices are, what those payments are, except in a very aggregated way. It also talks about minimizing cost when what you should be doing from a mindset point of view is finding Pareto optimal solutions, which includes the demand side or the consumption side of the market. And the markets today use software that basically considers, in some cases, both both renewables and consumption as fixed points in the system, that we optimize our fossil units for all fossil units, nuclear and hydro, around. And that creates a problem finding Pareto solutions. And so, but we have developed this terminology that really doesn't fit the economics that we want. Now, a little bit of the history of these markets. First of all, in the US, and I think still in Europe today, there was a question about whether or not we should use zonal markets and nodal markets. The difference between the two are nodal markets do not have intra-nodal congestion of the transmission system, and zonal markets do have that problem. And And we started out in the United States with zonal markets because we hadn't seen congestion in some of the utilities that, that were operating before that. And so the people in favor of zonal markets, mostly traders, which included Enron, argued that zonal markets were enough because they knew they could trade in the markets in a way that would create profits for them that were not just. In the US, after failing in several ISO attempts, we essentially moved to nodal pricing, and essentially the entire ISO markets have nodal pricing instead of zonal pricing. But the nodal pricing is for the physical trading, and the zonal prices we create are essentially weighted average of a group of adjacent nodes. And that satisfies the zonal pricing yearn that, the biggest thing that traders want is liquidity. And so in some of these nodes, there just isn't very much liquidity, and so they like the idea of zonal prices. The ISOs essentially do a favor for the traders and create zonal markets, and oftentimes the only thing that trades for the traders are zonal market prices, which in some sense are related to nodal prices because they're weighted averages of nodal prices. ISO started off trying to solve the dispatch problem with Lagrangian relaxation. Not to be demeaning to Lagrange, that was probably the best available at the time, which has been around for, at least 100 years. But in 1999, we held a conference, and Bixby generated that switching to mixed integer linear program could essentially solve the markets faster and better. And today, again, all of the ISO markets have voluntarily adopted mixed integer programming as their solution technique. Mixed integer programming essentially assumes away reactive power, assumes that there's some control at the distribution level that makes everything right. So we don't price reactive power. We sort of ignore it in the market sense, but we have to deal with it. And everybody has now essentially adopted what we call the standard market design, which is pricing real power using mixed integer linear programs to solve that problem. And essentially the distribution system or the transmission system is represented by what's called a distribution factor model, which is probably the most compact form of the transmission system approximation without reactive power and without having to deal with voltage angles and things like that. It turns out that the mixed integer linear program replaces the Lagrangian relaxation. By the way, Lagrangian relaxation often ended up with infeasible solutions that had to be massaged back, and the massage was, quote unquote, not very well understood. After Bixby demonstrated in 1999, in 2006, PJM adopted mixed integer linear program as their market solver. And again, I talked to the CEO, and he said, oh, yeah, we ran a beta test. We run everything in parallel, and it saves about $1 billion a year. And I said, where's the press release? I mean, if what you did just saved $1 billion a year, there should be, well, he actually issued a press release a couple of weeks later. But it took until 2017 to get all of the ISOs to vote. We didn't mandate the solution technique, but to get them all to choose to switch to mixed integer linear program. And it has invaded many other market designs, including investment markets. It's probably saving around $10 billion a year. That's simply changing from Lagrangian relaxation techniques to mixed integer programming. To a certain extent, most of the research would have been covered by that, $1 billion a year. And in the Go competition in 2023, we used those techniques, the competitors used that technique to solve very large mixed integer AC, optimal topology, dynamic programs. It's a lot to say. Here's my most favorite example of both a competition from independent generators and the ISOs. If you look at this carefully, you'll see that the ISOs sold off a lot of their nuclear generation because they didn't think it was earning the right rate of return. Over the period 97 to 99, they sold their nuclear generation off for 20 cents on the dollar, the book value dollar. After ISOs and essentially more divestiture of nuclear generation, we find in this table, the red gives you the numbers that are important, that the nuclear generation that was spun off and privatized went from the worst performing generation to the best. And why did they do that? Well, my conclusion was profit incentive. The vertically integrated utilities do not have proper incentives to operate their system. Here, if you're operating, you're making money for independent generators. And I think I didn't put this up here, but there's a calculation of how much extra profits the generators are making. Now, there's no sin in generators making profit, and what this does is actually lower prices because it's basically creating more inframarginal generation. Recently, I was at a meeting with Jeff Makel from NERA, and he said ISOs are too expensive. The implication was they're not cost effective. I did a little bit more research, found out that Jeff had basically produced the cost of running the ISOs and the regulatory system, and it was about 0.4% of the total retail value. And in essence, the argument, as eventually I think he agreed with me, the argument that ISOs weren't worth the effort just didn't fly. And the interesting thing is that the pricing at the consumer level hasn't changed in a century. They basically, the utilities take the ISO prices that are available on an hourly basis and just average them and send the average price to the consumers. So the consumers don't see the incentive to get off of the peak price, not the peak load. Okay, it's very important. And also during the time of ISOs, the employment in electric utilities declined 33%. Now, that's a mixed signal in the US because everybody's looking for jobs, good jobs, well-paying jobs. So the idea that you're saving money by eliminating jobs has a sort of double-edged sword. This is the total cost that Jeff created, said it was $2 billion. My answer to that is they save 5 times that in 1 year, at least. So 4 decades, the federal government, through its laws, have essentially endorsed competition, but haven't really, that message hasn't totally gotten through, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission hasn't really done all it could. Now, when the ISO markets, like I said before, were initially designed, we thought the private sector would take care of the investment necessary, but it didn't. And that we would be able to decide how to build new transmission, to connect new generators with some old models that had been lying around. And it wasn't good enough. So the current system isn't working. You look to the future and you see that they're planning on having about 3 times more consumption in the next 2 decades, including EVs, heat pumps, data centers, new industrial processes, and carbon capture. We're not, in the United States, we're not even close to thinking about all renewables, or, and we're talking more about carbon capture, things of that nature at this point in time. So it'll be a while before, and the current president does not like windmills. They're too loud. They kill birds, and there's a couple other reasons. And consumers don't express their willingness to consume. They basically just, they're bumps on a log in certain sense. Now, they're not allowed to be, which is essentially the continuation of 100 years of retail regulation. And my theory is we're about halfway there. We use the LMP and often call it, or people call it, market clearing. It isn't. It needs supplemental revenues to clear the market, which we don't really talk about. And my answer to that question is we need 2 things. We need consumers, especially large ones, bidding into the market, just like generators do, and better pricing, which I basically call average incremental cost pricing. And I'll try to convince you of that as we go along. We have demand response programs in the United States, which is essentially saying, after the fact, we'll basically tell some people to get off the system and we'll pay them to be ready to get off the system. Well, these programs do not work very well. They're all after the fact. They all operate on stale principles. And in essence, we pay them to get off the system. And who pays for them to get off the system? The other consumers. So to me, it doesn't make any sense. And so, and by the way, the idea of demand participating in the market is not new. And I cite 2 papers, one from 1978 by a guy named Fred Schweppe, who was a colleague of Paul's, and Bushnell, Hobbs, and Wolak saying, let's get the bidders into the market. It hasn't happened yet. The penetration of bidding into the market is less than 4% for the demand side of the market. And one of the things that people don't realize when the consumers bid into the market is they create scarcity prices. Right now, how do you create scarcity prices if demand is not bidding into the market? Does anybody know? How you do a whole bunch of calculations and figure out what the value of lost load is, yada, yada, yada. And a regulator sets the price. Now, let's see. So demand participating in the market is absolutely necessary to get to efficiency. My argument would be we start with the large consumers. And large consumers have gone from maybe 25 to 50 megawatts to 1 gigawatt. the size of the nuclear plant. Data centers are being proposed the size of a nuclear plant. And when in California, at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, which has a supercomputer or a hypercomputer, whatever you want to call it, when they turn it on, they immediately get a surge of 25 megawatts. And the ISO initially couldn't figure out what was happening when they turned on their, and now the compromise is Livermore has to give them an hour's notice before they turn on their supercomputer, and the ISO may essentially say, move it back a little bit or whatever. And there's a readily available participation model for the consumers, and that's the generation model. The only thing that changes between the generation and the consumers is the sign on the energy balancing equation. The rest of it is pretty much the same. And I've said before, when consumers are participating in the market algorithm pushes the consumption to the extent they said they could move, not an edict or a fiat that essentially creates an infeasible solution, to avoid the high prices, to consume more when there's lower prices. Today there's no signal about consuming at lower prices. Vertical demand says we're willing to pay an infinite amount of money for the price, so forget whether or not we want to consume when there's low prices. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what, if you look at what it's telling people. Scarcity prices set by consumers, and consumers can optimize their consumption, but don't know. What they don't know is how to do it. I mean, again, vocabulary. Large chemical producers don't speak the same language as electric market designers or electric market operators. And so they just do something. They either consume because who cares? I mean, data centers don't care, at least they arguably don't care about what the price is, with one exception. What is it? Come on now, you have to stay awake. It's called Bitcoin miners. And what we discovered, the interesting thing about Bitcoin miners is that you can love them or hate them. I think we're, in the United States, moving towards loving them because Trump has his own Bitcoin. But one thing they do is they have a model for their operations, and they know the trigger point when the market has a price that's not profitable for them, and so they get off the system. The problem is they get off the system too fast. I mean, they can drop their consumption unbelievably fast. If the ISO knew that was going to happen in advance, let's say a day in advance, then they could prepare for it. So, and if you look at, and when I was at ARPA-E, we sponsored some research on large consumers getting into the market. And the most astonishing thing is that the large consumers had very complex models of their operations. And they wouldn't fit into the electric utility optimization that takes place in the ISOs. And so we said, let's look at a reduced bid that fits into the ISO market. The first evidence that came back was there was no difference. And the researchers at the University of Texas at Austin said, oh, there's nothing here to publish. And I said, no, you don't understand. What we have just demonstrated is you can reduce their complex model to a very simple model and get more profits for them and not disturb their operations. They didn't know, they didn't know it. I mean, the industries didn't know how to behave in the market. In the US, prices are usually very much lower than they are here, and so a lot of people, industrial customers, for example, ignore them. Oh, the other thing is they make the system more reliable. If you have a price at which you will get off the system, you can price them out of the market. And you don't have to do things like forcibly curtail them or cut off their substation or whatever you do. Okay, I've said a little bit about, oh yeah, when the regulator sets the scarcity price, what kind of an investment signal does it send? Who knows? After the winter storm Uri, where actually the scarcity price triggered at $9 a kilowatt hour, the Regulatory Commission immediately thereafter changed it to $5. Now, if you're doing an investment model to see whether or not you want to build a new generator in Texas, which number do you use? You use a number, the number is stochastic, I guess is the best thing I can do for it. And rare events like this need some new modeling. They need to actually start thinking seriously about this problem at least a week in advance. Extreme weather, by the way, has this, we live with this model of reliability as having these failures of generation that are very unusual and very hard to predict. But bad weather is very predictable. You can see it coming in advance. The ISO, the Texas ISO, ERCOT, actually saw this coming, but didn't tell anybody. Or they told, they didn't raise the alarm. So when it actually got there, people weren't ready for it. So, I mean, I've done a lot of repetition. You need bid and demand to make this market work. It's amazing that it's been working without it for so long. Okay, some pictures. This is the model, close to it, you would see in an introductory economics book for supply and demand. There's a wall-raising equilibrium where the two lines cross. There's a supply curve that doesn't go to infinity, or goes to infinity vertically at some, after you've exhausted all the supply in the market. And there's a finite consumer and a finite producer surplus. Well, in the US ISO markets, the implication of the market, because of the vertical demand or the fixed demand, is that demand doesn't care what it pays. Its market surplus is infinite no matter what, because we don't know how to add things to infinity or subtract things from infinity. And this depends on the forecast being feasible. If, in fact, you run out of capacity and there is some elasticity in the demand system, that's fine. What happens here when you have an elastic demand curve? You cross at the capacity of the generation, and you cross above the the marginal cost of all the generators, creating profits for all the generators, which should stimulate investments. I don't know the actual analytics, but we know the direction of this. Now, what happens if the vertical demand is outside of the capacity of the market? Well, we move it inside. How do we move it inside? By curtailing demand, sort of in an arbitrary fashion. If you live next to a hospital or a police station, there's less of a chance that you get curtailed. The actual price, and this is sort of similar to the previous slide, is way up there. And in this case, it's still a convex market. And it's called the LMP with a scarcity price. But you can't create that from a market sense unless you have an elastic demand curve. But what we do is move it in, move the demand curve in, lower the price where it intersects with the supply curve, which again sends a very bad signal. Okay. This is pet peeve of mine. Some of the arguments about how renewables should bid into the market is an interesting question. Most of the literature has very fancy equations, 2 and 3 stage models, yada, yada, yada. My argument is that if there's decent forecast day ahead for renewables, you can get the probability of realizing how much renewables you're going to get in every hour. But there's also a probability that the power isn't going to show up. And what happens in ISO markets if the power doesn't show up? You have to buy back your day-ahead position from the market. So the probability of the power not showing up and the power not showing up is that you may have to buy it back. And so you have to estimate the probability of the power not showing up and what the real-time price is going to be. That's a difficult problem, but it's manageable and it's not solving very fancy equations. By the way, this holds for all generators, and actually consumers, because generators have a probability of failure, especially when you run them at their emergency conditions. And oftentimes, when you do that, you have a higher probability of failing, which means the generator has to buy back its position in the real-time market. And a lot of generators sort of balk at that idea of having to buy back their power. The interesting thing about renewables is the probability distribution goes to certainty as you approach the real-time market. I mean, for fossil generators, the probability doesn't go to 0 until you actually execute the real-time market. This is saying the same thing. So, what I've been saying all along is that you need discriminatory pricing in order to clear the market at certain points in time and not have make-whole payments. I invented a definition because I didn't see it anywhere in the literature called the effective price, which is the total payment to the generator divided by its total output, which includes make-whole payments. And if you look at that pricing mechanism, or the effective price that people pay, is very discriminatory. Here's a simple example. 2 consumers, 2 suppliers, and 4 effective prices. There's no uniform clearing prices in these markets. Oh, actually, there is, but you'll have to wait a few minutes to find out. Here it is, right here, I think. Second welfare theorem is that you have the Pareto allocation, and you need an appropriate distribution of the market surplus in order to satisfy the second theorem. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, you have to recognize that the market is not convex. If it's convex, LMPs work just fine. If it's not convex, there's a pretty good chance that the LMPs aren't going to work as efficiently as you want them to. As a matter of fact, originally in the general equilibrium model, they declared non-convexity as a market failure. That way they got around the fact that they proved general equilibrium. So, now, in non-convex markets, the law of one price is a special case. If the market clears off of a convex generator, the LMP will clear the market. Otherwise, you may need 2 prices, one of which I call the locational incremental price, the other one which is the LMP price, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. One of the results we know about the average incremental cost price is that It's transparent. There are no make-whole payments. There's no uplift payments. It has better prices spatially and temporally. It has better dynamic and off-peak pricing. We'll see that in an example. The chosen units are not allowed to set, the non-chosen units are not allowed to set the price. In the convex hull pricing system, generators that are not dispatched, that are uneconomical and may drive the market infeasible, can set the market price, which I think is silly, but is necessary in order to make convex hull pricing work. The economics is screwed up, but you have, if you want to go to convex hull pricing, you need to essentially make that assumption. The energy prices in general are about 10% higher, and the prices are revenue neutral and individually rational, if you get the demand participating in the market. Mathematically, it's simply you relax the market result, the efficient market result, the binaries to their optimal solution and zero. So that means that if the binaries are zero, and the relaxation, they're also zero. And we introduced what we call optimality cuts to essentially cut off some of the region in the convex hull or the relaxation that we know is infeasible. And we essentially solve this problem and generate the average incremental cost prices. The LMP prices are calculated the way we've always done LMP prices. Okay. The big difference, as we shall see, is the locational pricing and the fact that it eliminates make-whole or uplift payments. Where do the uplift or make-whole payments go, by the way? Do they disappear through a trap door? The answer to that is, of course not. That's an assumption you make when you want to prove theorem. They go towards the consumers. Do they go to the place where the price should be? No, they're peanut buttered or socialized, whatever you want to call it. Socialized has all kinds of connotations, so I prefer peanut butter or widely spread, smoothly spread. Not crunchy peanut butter, but just regular smooth peanut butter. And this is especially true for the ISO market pricing because they're repeated daily. The energy markets are repeated daily. And they give signals to consumers, especially investment entities, on what the prices could look like if they made the investment. Whereas these other pricing methodologies do not do this. Also, if you are in a bilateral trading situation, your negotiating point, or your lowest negotiating point, is average incremental cost, not marginal cost. If you have a non-convex generator with startup costs and no load cost, and you're negotiating a bilateral contract, you don't want to do it based on marginal cost. You want to do it based on what your costs out of your pocket are going to be. That's the lowest price you will accept. The highest price you will accept is the value to the consumers. Okay. We've already gone through these. Okay, so let's look at some examples, and my apologies, but I don't know how else to show this. If you have, let's say, a market with all fossil generators, not to degrade renewables, the market clearing process, after you find the Pareto optimal solution, goes to that dotted oval, and it clears at the marginal cost of that generator. but the marginal cost does not create enough revenue for that generator to cover its cost. And so if you set the market clearing price at the average incremental cost, all of the generators in the market make profits or break even. Don't need make-whole payments. Don't need uplift payments. So that's the simplest example. But the more complicated example is that the demand curve has some elasticity in it. So what I've done is moved the value of the step that didn't clear up to between the average incremental cost and the marginal cost. And so consequently, the Pareto solution will have the entities in red consuming, which is below the average incremental cost, but above the LNP cost. And that's more efficient than ignoring the consumption below the average incremental cost. That clears the market, it's Pareto efficient, and it also signals the lower valued consumption. So if that step was, let's say, renewables or something of that nature, it would actually have them consuming this stuff. And there's an open question about exactly what you're going to pay, and we'll get to that in a second. This is, if you like continuous models, this is a downward sloping demand curve that's continuous, and you see the blue triangles as the upper consumer surplus and what I've called the lower consumer surplus that get us to the Pareto optimal solution that we found in the first step in this operation. Now, what do you charge to people at the lower end? Well, Ramsey and Boiteau told us how to do this. Not definitively exactly, but you can charge them anything between what they bid and the marginal cost. If you charge them what they bid, they have incentives to gain. If they charge them marginal cost, the people paying the upper price pay more. And if you charge them somewhere in between, you get revenues from the lower market to essentially bring down the price of the higher price. And if you have fixed demand, the total surplus goes down. Okay, let's look at dynamic pricing. I'll go over this quickly. When you relax the binary variables, you don't relax the intertemporal binary variable constraints. And so once one of the binary variables is relaxed, all of them are relaxed. All of them in that equation are relaxed. And that does something that, that I didn't conceive of, but when I ran the models, it shows up. That this equation moves the fixed cost to the period of highest consumption, or the period, if you will, that caused the higher consumption. And here's my example. We have 3 generators. 2 of them are convex generators, and the middle one, generator 2, has a minimum operating level, a startup cost, and a minimum runtime. And the optimal consumption, by the way, I don't do fixed demand anymore, but I put in consumer values high enough so they didn't really matter. But the highest consumption period is period 4 at 430. The optimal dispatch turns out that you have to turn generator 2 on, because it has a 4-hour minimum runtime, in the second period to satisfy demand in the 4th period. Where should the prices for that go? Certainly not in periods 1 or 2. Actually, 3 is another story, but we won't get into that. So the appropriate way to do it is to take all of these fixed costs and assign them to the period that caused them to be generated. And so up here is what you get from the LMP. $10 across the board. Does it show you anything about where the prices should have been allocated? No. They're all hung up in make-whole payments, which are not transparent, and so they don't send a very good signal. Now, it turns out that the LIP and the CHP, the convex hull price, generate $10 prices in periods 1, 2, 3, and 5, and $190 in period 4. Now, if you have active consumers in the market, or consumers expressing their ability to move to different periods and to reschedule their production, that's a pretty potent signal. Also, it's a potent signal for where you should make generator investments. Now, and if you notice, the market with LMPs has a significant make-whole payment to generator 2 and 0 profits for generator 1, which is considerably lower priced than generator 2, but they come up with the same profits, 0. That's not very much of an incentive to make an investment. In the lower case, generator 1 makes $32,000 in profits. Pretty good signal. Well, we don't know exactly what the investment costs are, but a decent signal for investing in generator 1. Okay. The CHP price and the LIP price are the same. For what reason? Because the CHP price or the generator is at its lower operating limit, and when it's at its lower operating limit, the LIP and the CHP are the same. But if I move the upper limit above the lower limit, the convex hull, what does the convex hull do? It goes down. For no apparent reason from an economic point of view. But because essentially you divide the cost by the capacity and not the output of the generator. But the output of the generator caused all of the fixed costs to occur. But for the CHP, as the maximum price increases or is larger than the actual dispatch of the generator, the two prices will differ. This convex hull price will go down, causing uplift payments. Now, this is a story about entry. If generator 3 marginal cost is $190.48, it enters the market, pushes generator 2 out of the market. The market clears at generators 3 prices in 3 and 4, and the market surplus increases. So but generators 3 marginal costs are a little bit below that. And not only that, but if generators 3 marginal costs are $206.16, it will still clear the market. Why? Silence is golden. It's because it allows more generator 1 to produce at $10 a megawatt hour. And it's more efficient. And by the way, the market now is convex because the non-convex generator didn't clear the market. It was not part of the optimal dispatch. So it can't set the price. I'm not sure what the CHP would be in that case. Skip over this. Now, if you have flexible demand and you can shift your consumption to different periods or conserve a little bit, you can push generator 2 out of the market and all the prices legitimately fall to the LMP at $10. So if you're flexible, you make a hell of a lot more money. It's probably not enough time to go through this example, but it's what I already said. In the red box, the prices for the CHP and AIC differ because of the fact that the incremental generators output is lower than its capacity. Otherwise, if you assume away the fact that non-chosen generators can set the price, the LMP and the CHP look pretty much the same. And now the preferred way to generate the CHP is Danzig-Wolf decomposition. I think that's the fastest calculation. Well, anyhow. This list, what I was just talking about, the AIC is compatible with bilateral trading, has no uplift, no locational opportunity cost. Is that what LOC? What is it? Lost opportunity cost, sorry. And I don't understand that calculation anyhow, but AIC doesn't have it. Because that contributes to uplift if you actually do that. There's a real question of whether you can actually do that calculation correctly in the ISO markets. And so, at least in my opinion, the average incremental price scheme essentially dominates the convex hull pricing scheme. Okay, the standard thing. Question is, does it scale? Who knows who Sarah Cooper is? She's the comedian who lip syncs essentially Donald Trump during some of his speeches. Very humorous. Look her up on the internet. And she's also formerly a Google employee, and she's giving hints about how to look intelligent at any meeting. And she says, just ask the speaker to go back to its previous slide, stare at it for about 30 seconds, and say, does it scale? Everybody in the room now thinks you're intelligent. You know, by the way, you don't need any previous experience. Okay, does it scale? Well, the answer is yes. We've done experiments on actual MISO dispatches. This is the curve that plots the average incremental cost profit versus the LMP cost. It doesn't look very much different. If you look carefully, you can see the dots are different. But if you tune in to the latter part of the curve, you can see that the average incremental cost prices always yield higher or equal prices. And there are, there are 9 incremental generators that are that make below profits for LMP, which means they need a make-whole payment, but have 0 profits for average incremental cost payments, and they're the equivalent of marginal cost generators. They're incremental cost generators, but they have the same properties. Marginal cost generators make 0 profit at the marginal cost. These guys make 0 profit. And by lifting them all up to 0 or above, they'll make co-payments. So this summarizes what I just said. The other thing, by the way, about ISO markets is they eliminate, or they find complementarities, which is not clear you can do outside of the market. And they essentially treat empty cores, by essentially just establishing a price. And one of the things about empty cores is you have to get a third-party intervener to stop them from infinitely renegotiating prices. Okay, capacity markets and resource adequacy. The capacity markets have a very bad pedigree. Does anybody know why? Why did we establish capacity markets? I think the first one was in PJM. Because marginal cost prices didn't cover cost and didn't incent investment. And so what we did is we went to capacity markets instead of correcting the energy markets. Now, we've actually been correcting the energy markets over time. We don't really say that because we still call whatever we do the marginal cost, but we have been pouring more and more of the fixed cost of the generators into what we call the marginal cost, which isn't marginal cost anymore. And AIC is the logical conclusion of that, where there is no make-whole payments left. We've done some testing, by the way, we'll at scale. We've done some testing on European markets, and you get the same result. But the capacity markets were established for the wrong reason. You know, the right reason was to get the energy market prices right. And we basically skipped over that and went to capacity markets. And they really have never worked. They're zonal. They're very non-granular. And they have constantly raised complaints about how they actually function. But we need to intervene in this market for investments. Now, the question is whether or not the intervention is necessary because the pricing in the energy markets is too low, or it just needs intervention because of the public good nature of some of these investments. But so we model the system to try to calculate efficient system expansion models. System expansion includes both interconnection and transmission investment, which is actually just transmission investment. Now, as I said earlier, there wasn't a chicken and egg problem for vertically integrated utilities. They chose a generator, then they built the transmission to get that power to market. That's not true in ISOs. So I ordered a chicken and an egg from Amazon, and I'll let you know when I get the answer. An important part of this investment process is that beneficiaries pay. And we have had numerous court cases and numerous complaints about beneficiaries pay where we run the current set of models. And the current set of models has just about everything but beneficiaries pay. And if you had good modeling for beneficiaries pay, you could avoid a lot of these issues. The courts would be, as a matter of fact, we imposed beneficiaries pay as our measure of actually making these investments because of the, I think the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, with Judge Posner writing the decision, said you got to do beneficiaries pay. You can't do all these other models. We said, yes, beneficiaries pay, but we kept the old models. It'll make a lot of sense. We did expected network flows. That was for the artificial island case. I'll be glad to explain this in more detail if necessary after the presentation. It's not the balanced portfolio, which is, I would define a chicken in every pot. It's not the highway-byway in another ISO. Recently, the Kansas senators protested that the allocation of beneficiary pays was wrong. FERC agreed, reallocated $10 million, not a whole lot, but didn't tell the ISO to change the highway-byway methodology. And my answer is that we don't have good quantitative models yet. And to actually do beneficiaries pay, you do something that everybody hates. You need prices. And worse, you need future prices. So, I mean, when you build a transmission line, and let's say nothing else happens, what happens to prices at either end of the transmission line? At one end, consumer prices go down, and so do the generation prices. So consumers win, generation loses. At the other end of the line, you get exactly opposite behavior. But what do? We eat peanut butter. Why go to all the trouble of really calculating who benefits? Not only that, these calculations are based on assumptions about future prices, and probably a whole lot of other assumptions. But we lock the prices in for essentially as long as somebody doesn't succeed in arguing at FERC that they should be changed. Now, after you build the system, you can figure out who's benefiting, because some people's prices go up and some people's prices go down. And you don't build the transmission system unless it's Pareto optimal to build it, which means that you have enough surplus so you can clear all those markets. So, how do you do it? It's a stochastic process, but it's not what you will find in the literature. Maybe you would find it somewhere in the literature. But the process has to have, let's see, is this the right slide? Okay, first of all, the event space is very large. Which transmission assets are you going to build? That's a combinatorial problem. You don't build them all. So you build the optimal set in expectation of what the demand is going to be. But you don't know what's going to happen in the future. You don't know what the demand is going to be. You know, projections, well, it's 1 or 2 times current consumption. Well, the difference between 1 and 3 is significant. So you have to have the market participants in some way deciding on what the size of the event space is. Okay, all right, so the issue is you can't do the event space in any theoretically computational way. So you have to have the humans in the loop, but you don't have to have them in the loop in certain places. Let's see. Yeah, so one of my conclusions is that if you do the beneficiaries pay calculation and it turns out after the system is in operation that the beneficiaries change, every 5 years you can make that calculation and reallocate the benefits. People shouldn't be upset at that because the modeling shows that they're benefiting from the investment. Now, if the investment didn't produce a Pareto optimal incremental solution, then there's not enough money to make things right. So you need the expected Pareto optimal solution, plus you should, in my opinion, review the allocation arbitrarily every 5 years, so you can guarantee that the beneficiaries are paying, and if they are, they shouldn't complain. Reliability. I'm getting the signal I have to finish quick. 1 in 10 years is not an interesting reliability calculation anymore. We have to do extreme weather. Extreme weather has different properties than the N-1 calculation. But the good news is you can see it coming. You know, weather patterns don't simply materialize instantaneously like generator failures do. So you have time to prepare, but most of the ISOs have somewhat ad hoc reasons or ways of preparing for these things. And my solution is that we should start somewhat of a formal process of dispatch about a week ahead and update it daily and make sure that the populace knows. Now, if the demand is bidding into the market, it doesn't have to do anything special. It's telling you what it values consumption at,
and the ISO will tell them to get off the system if the weather predictions are going to basically create a whole bunch of outages and things of that nature, because the price is going to go up. If the price goes up, they have a value at which they'll get off the system. That'll be called the scarcity price. Who pays for reliability? Once again, the cost of reliability are peanut buttered. But if you look at Lindahl pricing, have you ever heard of Lindahl? I think he's a local, or at least a Nordic local. Eric Lindahl? I think his name is Eric Lindahl. But anyhow, Lindahl pricing says what? How do you price public goods? Based on beneficiaries. Or actually, club goods also fall in that category too. So, how do you calculate beneficiaries? Well, what happens if the real-time market fails? And these are easy questions. It's undergraduate questions. If the real-time market fails, everybody loses their profits. So who are the beneficiaries of not failing? The people with the largest profits. If you're on the margin and making zero profits, the market failure doesn't mean very much to you. But if you have positive surplus or positive profits, the value of a reliable system is your profits. Discriminatory pricing. You don't price the marginal or incremental generators, but you do price the really cheap marginal cost, high investment cost generators, and they're the ones who are benefiting from the system not failing. Energy parks are not a bad idea, but they got off on the wrong foot. And how do you calculate all these new and existing methodologies? These problems are really difficult to solve, and they need inputs that are not hard. For playing dice, we know what the probabilities are. Here, we don't know. We have to make them up in some way. And you need the agreement for the market participants in a certain sense. And over the past 10 years, ARPA-E has essentially participated in or had programs to find faster solutions. And they did, because we gave them money if they found the best solutions. At least we think we gave them money because they found the best solutions. So we were able to solve large-scale nodal market period models with topology optimization, with binary variables, ACOPF, yada, yada, yada. Now, one of the things you have to realize is we have no optimality guarantee. So pretty much we argue that since the higher performing contestants in the market got solutions close to each other, that you're probably close to the optimal solution, but that's a bunch of hand-waving. Now, have these cases has this research turned into positive benefits? The answer is yes. First of all, we have 22 cases of actual topology optimization, including 2 in Europe that I know of, increasing the capacity of the network by 5 to 25% and utilizing it. And this is nothing more than taking, right now, it's nothing more than taking units out of the system and getting a better topology. And this is really true for renewables, because renewables come from different directions. When the wind direction changes, the renewables change also, and consequently the topology you have isn't necessarily the optimal topology. And so you have to do topology optimization. And there's a literature in the Southwest Power Pool and in MISO where this is exactly what's happening. Topology optimization is good for reliability. Corey Hedman, a study for special protection systems for reliability, each one took about 4 months. Corey Hedman produced optimal topology software that produced 90 of the 94 PJM protection systems overnight. More recently, Pearl Street has basically taken a MISO application of interconnection and transmission expansion that took MISO 2 years and 16,000 hours of computer time, and the Pearl Street software, which was a performer in one of the ARPA-E projects, produced the same solution, or essentially within 1%, in 10 days and 8 CPU hours. And they did that by internalizing what the humans did. For example, in the old system, you put a transmission line in, you run the model, you look at the results, don't work. Put a new transmission line in with higher capacity, look at the results, works, maybe. Or you put a transmission line in some other place. Every one is a new run of the system. Pearl Street internalizes all that. It's not AI. It says if a 345 kV line doesn't work, maybe a 500 kV line will work. And it does all that internally rather than having a human being look at the results and then hypothesizing what might work. And it can be done fast, and Pearl Street has a very fast algorithm called Sugar. This is a diagram that I can't figure out, but that's what happens. Sugar runs on an Amazon cloud computer, and that's the difference. So we're just about on time. What should we do? Well, we should get rid of the convex vocabulary. It doesn't work. By the way, convexity doesn't magically appear in an all-renewable system because you have hydropower, you have hydrothermal power, which has startup and no load costs. You have carbon capture and sequestration. So if you think fossil generators are going away by 2050, think again. And, we still have 30% of our power generated by coal. Promote demand, bid and demand. That's very important that it be bid and demand and not demand response. Adopt average incremental cost pricing. Fix the transmission expansion and interconnection process. By the way, you should put large consumers into the interconnection process. They need to be part of that process because they significantly affect the operation of the network. Include extreme weather, and always ends up hopefully in lower prices. So that's it. If you're interested in reading some papers, you can go to this website and read in more detail. And since I'm going to be around for the week, I'm available for people who don't think I got it right, or who want to know more about getting it right. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any questions?
Did I put you all to sleep?
Thanks, Dick. Maybe I can ask a few questions. So I see that you promote demand, bid in demand, of course, and then you talk a lot of good things about AIC, average incremental cost pricing, and you said it bids both CHP, convex pricing, and conventional LMPs, especially when we have more and more elastic demands. But is there also any objections for AIC, or no, it's absolute winner?
One of the inventors of average incremental or convex hull pricing said he thinks it's important for the price to go down as the quantity goes up. I said, what's the importance about that, since it's not consistent with the non-convexities or the scale economies of the generator? He said he thought he liked it better. My feeling is that that's not the answer to the question.
Yes.
You know, and creating make-whole payments and uplift payments is not a good idea. And I think there's some serious flaws in the thinking of convex hull pricing. You may call it creating a theoretical model and then trying to force the existing reality into the theoretical model.
Very good. And one more maybe question that I can ask on behalf of everyone here. So we have many PhD students here and researchers, and they are working on their project. So if you want to suggest one or two important topics that researchers, they have to focus a lot on that, what would be your choices?
Well, my feeling is that average incremental cost pricing is not universally accepted. I have a couple ISOs whose staff members think it's a good idea, but the management is too busy doing something else. It's always worthwhile speeding up these algorithms and hopefully at some point in time getting rid or having a better approximation to reactive power in the dispatch models for the market. Right now, like I said, they don't exist. And I think the interesting example is the common reason given why they don't exist is because the marginal cost of reactive power is very low. And that's probably true once you've dispatched the generator, the good old fossil fuel generator, or the geothermal generator, or the hydro generator. The question is, and this is what actually happens in the ISO models, they see that they need reactive power in a given region. Standard argument is reactive power doesn't travel well. So they need some reactive power in a specific region. So what do? Anybody know? They put an artificial import constraint on energy into that market. It's artificial. And that causes them to do less importing and start up an old clunker generator with high costs. To do what? To create reactive power. Now, do you tell me that the cost of that reactive power is marginal cost? I'll tell you, you're just not thinking through the problem. The incremental cost of that is the cost of starting up that generator, the cost of keeping it on the system for its minimum runtime, and the fact that it actually lowers the marginal cost of the real power. Those three things don't make any sense to me. But we don't have a good approximation. I've worked on it a little bit, but I haven't gotten very far. A linear approximation of reactive power consumption, or an AC model that has a pricing system compatible with it. And notice here that the pricing system relaxes the binary variable, so you don't need the exact same model that you found the Pareto efficient solution with, but you do need something that's compatible with the good pricing qualities that are good. And that's an open area. And also an interesting issue is that average incremental cost pricing gives you an average incremental flow gate price on a transmission line where it can be positive and the FMP, the flow gate marginal price, is zero. Now, what does the flow gate marginal price tell you if it's zero? That you don't need any more capacity on that line. But if the average incremental cost flow gate price is non-zero, that means there's a non-zero increment in the capacity of that line that could create a higher Pareto optimal solution, because you completely displace a generator that's got startup, no load, and minimum runtime calculations. So there's a lot of information that comes out of these models. Transmission or topology optimization is not only good for operations, proving a Pareto solution for optimization, but it's also just essentially the same problem for generation expansion and interconnection. What you're doing is looking at putting lines in and maybe taking lines out, which is a topology optimization problem. None of that actually appears in any of the models we have today. So.
Is there any other question? Yeah?
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask regarding the day-ahead and the real-time market in the US. Is this the only market timeframes that is currently existing in the United States? Or are there other traded timeframes like we have in Europe that are more long-term?
I'm not sure what your question is. I mean,
you refer to the day-ahead and the real-time market, and then I was wondering, okay, in Europe we have month-ahead markets. We have also year-ahead markets where like volumes can be traded way in advance. And like this is a precursor for the question, and I wanted to know, for the case of the United States, like is there like what are the mechanisms that is currently used to determine the volume that is made available for these markets?
well, yeah, I mean, when we designed ISO markets originally, the idea is the investment markets, the energy markets would produce high enough prices that would stimulate the investments. It's turned out not to be the case. We also have capacity markets, which are longer duration, 3-year duration, things like that, which don't work very well. We also have bilateral trading in these markets where essentially if the ISO markets are physical financial markets, it's hard to sort of explain exactly how that works. But there is a lot of bilateral trading that goes on in the forward market that the ISOs don't see. It appears in what's called the quarterly report at FERC. And it shows that there's a lot of trading. And most of this trading is risk aversion. You're trying to get the big banks to pick up some of the risk. The old system says the consumers pick up all the risk.
Yeah, okay, I'll be short. My name is Zhenhua. I'm from UC San Diego. I think we're seeing rising demand from data centers, the so-called hyperscalers. And I'm wondering if, just from a regulator utility perspective, that you can design some certain special participation programs, applying certain special pricing rules for these large chunk of industrial customers to prove some of the ideas that would work as part of the implementation plans. And
I don't think you have to special rules for them. You just have to have a bidding demand model, and that takes care of it. I mean, it does the job. It may need some changes to it, but it's fairly adequate.
I mean, the U.S. is very complicated, but just to be clear, there are 49 state public utility commissions, and they have complete jurisdiction over retail loads, which is any end-use customer, and they can permit them to bid into the ISO markets if it's allowed. And in Texas, they do bid into the IO market through an intermediary for reliability purposes. But in most states, they don't have retail competition, and they're not subject to FERC jurisdiction, and they're not permitted to bid into the markets. And you know, there's an old aphorism, and I'm not criticizing Dick, but at the state level, someone comes from they say, "I'm from Washington, and I'm here to help you," and they give them a plane ticket to go back to Washington. To really understand what's going on on the retail side, you really have to look state by state on what's permitted. So many states now permit owners of rooftop PV to deal with an intermediary, an aggregator, and the aggregator can bid that as supply into the market. Exactly why they're called virtual power plants is a mystery to me, but that's what they're called. So I'll discuss this maybe this afternoon a little bit more. It's a very complicated system because of the diverse structure of the electric power industry and the important role of the states, which have complete jurisdiction over end-use customers.
I agree completely that the bid and demand model has to be accompanied by the state regulation.